These files were made up by Comey. They were made up by Obama. They were made up by the Biden You ought to be speaking about Bill Clinton, who went to the island 28 times.
You will be remembered as one of the worst attorney generals in history. Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell made young girls available to Trump on multiple occasions. Maxwell presented a young girl to President Trump who spent more than 20 minutes apparently flirting with her. I'm not saying that the president is a pedophile, but there is a lot of evidence in these files that suggests that he's very close friends with a lot of men who are pedophiles.
It didn't begin with outrage. It began with a sentence that sounded too controlled to matter, and that's exactly why it did. The hearing had already drifted past relevance. Voices blended into routine, papers moved. Questions were asked the way they always are, predictable, contained, forgettable. The kind of setting where nothing truly breaks through, because nothing is supposed to. And then Jasmine Crockett spoke, not louder, quieter. "I want to redirect this discussion," she said, her tone so even it almost disappeared into the room. No one stopped her. Not yet, because nothing in that sentence felt dangerous. But the next one shifted, something people couldn't immediately explain. "I'd like to address materials that have remained outside public review, despite their connection to known investigations." A pause followed, but not from her. From the room. It was subtle. A hesitation. A delay in movement. The kind that happens when people realize, just a second too late, that the conversation is no longer where they thought it was. Still, no one interrupted, because she hadn't said enough to justify stopping her. That came next. "These materials," she continued, glancing briefly down, "are connected to records tied to Epstein, and individuals whose names were never formally examined in that context." Now, the room was listening. Not reacting. Not yet. Just listening. And then she said it. Calm. Flat. Unforced. "Among those references is the name Donald J. Trump." No emphasis. No explanation. Just placement. And in that moment, the hearing stopped being routine. Even before anyone responded, everyone understood something had just shifted. For a few seconds after the name was spoken, nothing moved. Not because nothing happened, but because no one was ready to decide how to react. The room didn't erupt. There was no immediate objection, no sharp denial, no dramatic interruption, just a quiet recalibration, as if everyone present was quickly reviewing the boundaries they had been operating within, and realizing those boundaries might no longer apply. The hearing itself hadn't changed. Same room, same agenda, same officials seated in familiar positions under the same overhead lights that had witnessed dozens of similar sessions before it. But something inside it had shifted, because this was no longer routine oversight. This was something else, something undefined. Jasmine Crockett didn't rush to explain what she meant. She didn't repeat the name. She didn't reinforce the moment. Instead, she allowed it to settle. And that decision, more than the statement itself, created the first layer of pressure. Across the panel, subtle reactions began to surface. One member leaned back, arms folding slowly across his chest, not in defiance, but in distance. Another adjusted his microphone, then chose not to speak. A staffer near the wall stopped typing entirely, eyes fixed forward, waiting for clarification that didn't come. Because she wasn't offering it. Not yet. The chairperson glanced down at his notes, then back up again, as if expecting someone else to intervene first, but no one did. And that hesitation mattered. Because in hearings like this, interruption is control. And control had just been delayed. Crockett turned a page in front of her. A small movement, but intentional enough to draw attention without demanding it. "This isn't about speculation," she said calmly. "It's about documented material that was never fully examined in open proceedings." There it was again. Not a claim, not an accusation, just a framing that made the absence of information feel more significant than its presence. A voice finally cut in from the side, measured, careful. "Congresswoman, are you suggesting these materials were intentionally withheld?" It wasn't a challenge. Not yet. It was something softer, an attempt to define the ground before it shifted further. Crockett didn't answer immediately. She looked up not at the person who asked, but across the room again, as if measuring something beyond the question itself. "I'm saying," she replied, "that there are records, and those records include names that were never subjected to the level of scrutiny others were." A pause, long enough to register, short enough to avoid resistance. "And that," she added quietly, "creates a gap." She didn't explain the gap, didn't define it, didn't close it, because leaving it open was the point. The word gap didn't sit comfortably in the room, because a gap implies something missing, and something missing implies something that should have been there. That's when the tone began to shift, not louder, but sharper. A committee member leaned forward, this time without hesitation. "Let's be precise," he said, voice controlled but firmer now. "Are you claiming these records were deliberately excluded?" There it was, the first real attempt to pin her down, to force clarity, to turn something controlled into something confrontational. But Crockett didn't take the direction. She didn't match the tone. She didn't speed up. Instead, she stayed exactly where she had been. "I'm not making a claim," she said evenly. "I'm describing what exists and what doesn't." It was a small distinction, but in that room, it changed everything. Because claims can be challenged. Descriptions are harder to interrupt, especially when the details haven't been fully revealed yet. Another voice entered, slightly more impatient. "Then describe it clearly." A few heads turned. The pressure was building now, not explosively, but steadily. Crockett glanced down at her notes again. Not to read, just to pause, just long enough to slow the room back down. "These materials," she continued, "originated during a phase of review connected to the Epstein case, where multiple names were catalogued based on association, contact, or reference. The phrasing was careful, deliberately broad. Not enough to accuse, but enough to include. And within that catalog," she added, "some entries were examined in detail. A beat. Others were not. There it was again. The absence. The gap. Now more defined, but still incomplete." "Why not?" someone asked quickly. This time, the question carried edge. Because now it wasn't just curiosity. It was discomfort. Crockett didn't answer the why. Instead, she adjusted the frame again. "The classification of those entries," she said, "determined the level of follow-up they received." Another pause. "Classification by who?" The same voice pressed. Now the room was leaning in. Not physically, but mentally, trying to catch something before it was fully said. Crockett looked up again. This time, her gaze held a fraction longer. "By those responsible for managing the review process," she replied. It was technically an answer, but it gave nothing specific. No names, no departments, no direct accountability. And that was intentional, because now the focus wasn't just on the documents, it was on the process behind them. And that made it harder to contain. A chair shifted sharply to the left. Another member whispered something under his breath, too low to hear, but enough to signal irritation, because the conversation was slipping, not out of control, but out of structure. And then, without raising her voice, without changing her pace, Crockett added one more line. "Some names," she said, "were treated as points of inquiry. A pause. And others." Another pause, slightly longer this time, "were not pursued at all." Silence. Not complete, but heavy enough to feel. Because now the question wasn't just what was in those files. It was why certain names never moved beyond them. And no one in the room had answered that yet. By now, the room understood something was unfolding in layers. Not all at once. Not in a way that could be immediately challenged or dismissed. And that made it harder to stop. The chairperson finally leaned forward, fingers lightly touching the edge of the desk. "Congresswoman," he said, tone measured but firmer than before, "we need to maintain focus on the scope of this hearing." It sounded procedural, neutral, but the timing gave it weight, because it came after the name had been introduced, and after the gaps had been outlined. Crockett didn't push back, didn't resist. "I understand," she replied calmly. And for a brief moment, it seemed like she might step away from the direction she had opened. But she didn't. She simply adjusted it. "This is within scope," she continued, her voice still even, "because it relates to how investigative material is categorized and what happens to it afterward." The phrasing was deliberate. She wasn't arguing relevance. She was redefining it. A few members exchanged glances. Not dramatic, quick, but noticeable enough to signal that the line between procedure and substance was starting to blur. The chairperson paused, as if considering whether to interrupt again. He didn't, and that hesitation created space. Crockett turned another page. Again, small, controlled, intentional. "These records didn't disappear," she said. "They were logged, indexed, and stored." A beat. But not all of them moved forward. Now the framing had shifted again. This wasn't about missing information anymore. It was about stalled information. And that carried a different kind of weight. A voice from the far end of the panel spoke up quieter, but more direct. "Are you implying selective review?" It was the closest anyone had come to saying it outright. The word selective hung in the air longer than expected. Because once introduced, it couldn't be easily removed. Crockett didn't confirm it, didn't deny it. She let it sit for a second, just long enough for it to register across the room. "I'm pointing to outcomes," she said. Some records led to follow-up actions. Another pause. Others stopped at documentation. Again, no accusation, no direct blame, just a pattern. And patterns are harder to argue against when the full data set hasn't been revealed yet. A staff member near the back shifted position, whispering something to a colleague. Papers moved again, but slower now, more deliberate. Because the room wasn't just listening anymore, it was tracking, trying to anticipate where this was going. And more importantly, what might come next. Crockett looked down briefly, then back up. "There's a timeline attached to these materials," she said. That was new. A subtle escalation, but significant. Because timelines introduce sequence, and sequence introduces accountability. And within that timeline, she added, there are clear points where certain entries stopped progressing. A pause followed. Longer this time, not accidental. And those points, she said quietly, don't align with the level of scrutiny applied elsewhere. No one interrupted. Because now, interrupting would require engaging directly with what she was outlining. And no one had enough information yet to do that safely. Which meant, for the first time since she began, she wasn't being redirected. She was being allowed to continue. And that changed the balance in the room. By this point, the room was no longer trying to understand if something was being suggested. It was trying to determine how far it would go, because the pattern had been established. Records existed. Some moved forward, others didn't. And now, there was a timeline, which meant the next step was obvious. Identification. A senior member of the panel leaned in, voice lower this time, but far more deliberate. "Congresswoman," he said, "you've described a process and an inconsistency." A brief pause, but you haven't identified who made those determinations. There it was. The pressure had shifted. No longer about the records, but about responsibility. Crockett didn't respond immediately, not because she didn't have an answer, but because she understood the weight of the moment. Naming a process creates tension. Naming a person creates consequence. She kept her posture steady, hands resting lightly on the desk in front of her. The review process, she said carefully, involved multiple layers of oversight. It sounded like a step back, a generalization, but it wasn't. It was a setup. And within those layers, she continued, decisions were made about which entries required further examination and which did not. The same structure, the same pattern, but now framed closer to decision-making. A member from the right side interrupted this time more directly. By whom? Short, sharp, impossible to ignore. Several heads turned again, because now the room wasn't just listening, it was anticipating a shift. Crockett lifted her gaze. For the first time, she didn't look across the room. She looked toward the panel itself. "I think," she said slowly, "what matters more at this stage is not a single individual." A pause. It almost sounded like deflection. But then she added, "It's whether the process allowed certain names to remain unexamined." Now the focus widened again. Not a person, a system. And that made it harder to shut down. Because systems don't respond defensively. People do. The same member leaned back slightly, clearly unsatisfied. "That doesn't answer the question," he said. And he was right. But Crockett didn't correct it, because she wasn't trying to answer yet. She was still building. "There are patterns in the documentation," she continued, ignoring the interruption without confronting it. "Patterns in timing, patterns in follow-up, patterns in omission, each word placed carefully, each one tightening the frame. And those patterns," she said, "are consistent enough that they can't be dismissed as random." Silence followed. But this time, it wasn't hesitation. It was pressure. Because now, the implication wasn't vague anymore. It was structured, observable, repeatable, which made it harder to argue against without seeing the full records. A staffer near the front shifted in his seat, glancing briefly toward someone behind him. No one spoke, because the next logical step was exposure, and everyone in the room knew it. Crockett looked down one more time, then back up. "This isn't about speculation," she said again, almost as a reminder. "It's about what the records show." A slight pause. "And what they don't." And with that, the room reached a point where continuing meant one thing. The next layer wouldn't just describe the system. It would begin to reveal what was inside it. At this stage, the hearing was no longer moving forward naturally. It was being managed, carefully, deliberately, because what had started as a structured discussion was now approaching something far less predictable. The chairperson adjusted his posture again, this time more decisively. "Congresswoman," he said, voice firmer than before, "we're moving into areas that require clear procedural grounding." The phrasing had changed. Less neutral, more controlled. It wasn't just about staying on topic anymore. It was about setting limits. Crockett nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "I understand the importance of procedure," she replied. Calm, measured, unchanged. And then, without raising her voice, she stepped forward again. "Which is why documentation matters," she added. A subtle shift, but enough to hold her ground without directly challenging authority. The chairperson exhaled slightly, as if preparing to interrupt again. But before he could, she continued. "There are entries," she said, "that include dates, cross-references, and internal notes, indicating potential relevance." Now the details were becoming tighter, more specific, harder to generalize away. "And in several of those entries," she went on, "there are indicators that follow-up was expected." A pause, but never recorded. That landed differently, because now the issue wasn't just omission. It was interruption of process. A member from the far side leaned forward quickly. "Do you have those documents with you?" he asked. The question came faster than the others, less controlled, because now the conversation had reached a point where evidence mattered more than framing. Crockett didn't hesitate this time. "Yes," she said. One word. Clear. Uncomplicated. And for the first time, the room reacted. Not loudly, but visibly. A shift in posture. A tightening of expressions. Because confirmation changes everything. Up until now, this had been structure, pattern, implication. Now, it had weight. The chairperson stepped in immediately. "Then those documents should be submitted through proper channels," he said, not selectively referenced in open discussion. There it was. The strongest pushback yet. An attempt to contain the information, not by denying it, but by redirecting how it could be used. Crockett didn't resist. She didn't argue. She didn't even acknowledge the restriction directly. Instead, she placed her hand lightly on the folder in front of her. A small gesture, but deliberate. "They will be," she said. A pause followed. Short, controlled. And then she added, "But before that?" Another pause, just slightly longer. It's important to understand what those documents represent. The room went still again, because now the line had been drawn. Procedure had been asserted, but it hadn't stopped her. It had only delayed her, and everyone present could feel it. The next moment wouldn't be about structure anymore. It would be about substance. By now, the room wasn't asking questions the same way anymore, because the answers were no longer the main concern. The timing was. Every pause carried more weight than the words themselves. Every glance meant more than any formal response, because everyone understood whatever came next would define everything that came before it. Crockett didn't open the folder. She didn't lift a document. She didn't read a single line. And that choice mattered, because it meant the moment wasn't about proving something. It was about placing something, carefully, precisely, without giving the room time to reorganize around it. Across the panel, the posture had changed. Less interruption, more stillness. Not because the pressure had eased, but because it had concentrated. The chairperson no longer spoke. Not yet. Because stepping in too early would risk drawing attention to exactly what he was trying to contain. And waiting too long would allow it to unfold. So he waited, just like everyone else. Crockett looked forward again. No notice. No page turns. No visible preparation, which made it harder to anticipate what she would say next. "There's a distinction," she said quietly, "between information that is unavailable, a pause, and information that is present but unaddressed." No one interrupted, because that line didn't accuse. It defined. And definitions are difficult to challenge in real time. She let the words settle. Didn't expand them. Didn't clarify them. Because the room was already doing that on its own. Filling in gaps. Connecting earlier statements. Reconstructing the timeline she had been building piece by piece. And when that distinction exists, she added, just as calmly, it raises a different kind of question. Another pause. Longer this time. Not accidental. Not uncertain. Controlled. Deliberate. And that question, she said, isn't about what we know. The room stayed completely still. It's about what was allowed to remain unexamined. Silence followed. Not empty, but heavy enough to signal that the next line wouldn't extend the discussion. It would end it. No one spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because anything said too early would feel misplaced. The room had reached that narrow space where timing mattered more than position, and Crockett didn't rush it. She let the silence do what it needed to do. Let it settle across the panel, into the pauses, into the uncertainty that had been building from the very beginning. Then, without opening the folder, without referencing a single page, she delivered the line that reframed everything. "In those records," she said calmly, "there are documented references indicating that certain individuals were flagged." A pause, but not advanced for follow-up review. No reaction yet, because it still sounded procedural, still sounded contained. Until she finished it. And one of those individuals, she added, was Donald J. Trump. No emphasis, no change in tone, just completion. And that's when the room shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. A chair moved sharp enough to break the stillness. Someone reached for their microphone, then stopped halfway. Another member looked down immediately, as if reviewing notes that hadn't changed. Because now, the structure she had been building, pattern by pattern, layer by layer, had connected to a single point. A name that carried weight beyond the room. The chairperson spoke, finally. "We need to be very careful here," he said, voice controlled but tighter now. "References without full context can be misleading." It wasn't a denial. It wasn't even a direct challenge. It was containment, an attempt to pull the moment back into procedural limits. But the timing had already passed. Because Crockett didn't respond. She didn't defend the statement, didn't repeat it, didn't expand it. She simply allowed it to exist, without support, without explanation, without interruption. and that made it harder to dismantle. Because now, anyone who wanted to challenge it had to engage with it directly, and no one moved first. A quiet exchange happened at the far end of the panel, too low to hear, but urgent enough to notice. Staff members shifted again. Not casually this time, purposefully, because the room understood something in that moment. The discussion had crossed from process into implication, and there was no clean way to reverse it. Not without reopening everything that had just been said. And no one in the room seemed ready to do that. After that, the hearing continued. Technically, questions resumed. Notes were referenced. Procedures were restated. The structure returned at least on the surface. But something had changed in a way that couldn't be reset, because the conversation no longer existed only in the room. It had already moved beyond it, not through volume, not through confrontation, but through placement. A sequence of statements, delivered without urgency, had introduced a gap that no immediate response could fully close. And that gap didn't rely on certainty. It relied on absence. What was followed up? What wasn't? What was examined? What remained in the background, documented, but unresolved? No conclusion was announced that day. No final determination was made in that moment. And yet, the outcome didn't depend on either of those things, because the impact wasn't created by proving something outright. It was created by making something difficult to ignore, quietly, without escalation, without repetition, just enough to shift attention and leave it there. In the days that followed, responses would come. Clarifications, interpretations, pushback, context, all of it expected. All of it part of the process. But none of it changed the fact that, for a brief moment inside that room, control had shifted. Not through authority, not through interruption, but through restraint. And once that kind of shift happens, it doesn't fully return to where it was before.